Everyone, thanks for coming out. I'm Kyle Cleveland, the Associate Director of our Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. The event tonight is of special interest to me. I teach a course in race and ethnicity, and in fact I've just been talking about these subjects, going through John Dower's work the last couple of days. And this topic of media representation in East Asia images of Japan, this group of scholars have done quite a broad range of work. And I feel that we're very fortunate to have Naoko Shimazu, Paul Morris, and Christine Hahn coming all the way over from the University of London. Ed Vickers is at Kyushu University, and I'd like to thank Ed for having helped coordinate and put this conference together. This group of scholars are publishing a book about which you have a flyer, and will be involved in a conference in Fukuoka in September. And so we're getting kind of a version of that. And for TUJ, I feel we're very fortunate to have these scholars here. We have quite a lot to go through here in this time because each of these scholars will be giving a presentation. And there will be a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. I wanted to draw your attention, I think you have these flyers here, that includes information about the book that relates to the research that they've been doing, and that book will be published, I think, in October. So we will have a Q&A later, but right now I'd like to introduce Naoko Shimizu from University of London, who will give a more detailed introduction of this group of scholars. It went to sleep.
Asleep, yeah.
Hello. Hi, good evening. My name is Naoko Shimazu from the University of London Birkbeck College. And I'm very grateful, well actually we're all very grateful, the panel, to the Temple University for hosting us today. And my role here is actually to introduce the research network that we formed as a result of research funding we received in the United Kingdom. And also to give you some very kind of brief overview of the kind of issues or images of Japan that we're dealing with within this project. Now, this panel is basically represents the core team of the research network that we created in 2011, and it's called JINEAN, which I think you have the that's right, Japan and East Asia National Identities and Education Network. And well, the reason why we got this rather awkward acronym is because Liverpool Trust, who is the funder of the project, they insisted that we have one. And it's, I mean, it sort of had a very simple genesis in that four of us got together. The three of the panelists here are comparative education people, specialists, and I myself am a historian. And we thought it would be very interesting in this day and age when we hear so much about China that refocus on Japan again and see what sort of images do the East and Southeast Asian societies create in their respective societies about Japan and the role of Japan in the recent decades. So our focus is essentially on the post-war period. And although there are historians included in this project, we actually did focus mostly on the post-war period. Now, there are certain characteristics about this network. And firstly, it may not be surprising that it is a very interdisciplinary network. And it's not, a bunch of historians getting together with one comparative education person. It really is quite a good mix. And we're very proud of this fact because one of the biggest problems of interdisciplinarity is actually having a successful way of communicating with each other. And we have really tried hard to do that. And so we have not only comparative education specialists, historians, anthropologists, political scientists, and cultural studies. Now, you may know that cultural studies people and the rest of us don't really talk to each other very much normally, but in this particular case, we managed to work together a framework that enabled us to talk to each other rather effectively, we hope. Now, another characteristic about this particular network is that it brings together academics and practitioners. And this is something that we really tried very hard to do, because this interfacing of, having some kind of forum of us academics trying to communicate our academic intellectual concerns and problems to practitioners, and us actually listening to the people who implement education, teach history in these schools. We wanted to hear what they thought and how they do their teaching, and so on and so forth. So, for example, we have had this high school teacher of history from Beijing involved in a project all the time. And in one of our earlier meetings, we actually had a very high-ranking negotiator on the Sino-Japanese Joint Textbook Commission, who also was involved in unofficial drafting of the joint textbook. And we have partners. The main core team actually rests in the UK, except Edward Vickers. He moved to Kyushu Dainaku during the tenure of this program. So we now have one Japan base. But we have partners in Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Seoul, Philippines, Singapore, and Malaysia. So another thing that you probably noticed from this network is actually it's not just about Japan, China, and Korea. And because you may be more familiar with the connecting of these three countries, but we wanted to expand the remit to include Southeast Asia. And this has enabled us to come up with really rather interesting perspectives on images of Japan, which actually differ considerably from the three countries that we tend to focus on, more generally speaking. Now, so we do three things. First of all, we try to analyze the portrayal of Japan in East and Southeast Asian societies. And then secondly, we want to look at, or we've been looking at, how and why this portrayal has changed in recent years. Sorry, did I? Yeah. And thirdly, what do these changing images of Japan reveal about the ways in which these societies construct their own identities? So what we didn't have time to do, and not enough money to do, was actually how Japan itself may have contributed to the portrayals described. Nor did we have time to look at how Japan portrays either its neighbours or itself, because, well, as I said, because of time and funding constraints. Now, another thing that I'd like to mention is about sources and materials that we consulted on this project. We have two kind of main types of materials. The first type is what one might call the official materials, or official documents, or official textbook materials. And these you may be more familiar with when you're looking at constructed images of Japan in East Asia in particular. But we also became very interested, obviously, in including other types of materials, particularly in popular cultural media. And so this meant that including materials such as films, television programs, like the trendy dramas, animation, manga, and even including things like the Japanese lifestyle, sort of aspirational aspects of the Japanese culture that attracts a lot of attention in East and Southeast Asia. And so basically these two types of materials, the official variety and the popular cultural material variety, they help to give this slightly more holistic image of how Japan, or images of Japan, can be constructed. And we are particularly interested in how the youth, the young people, form their images of Japan in these societies. So our focus is very much on the youth, and it's a sort of two-pronged approach, the official approach and the unofficial, more cultural, popular cultural approach. Now, the reason why we do this is because we believe that political socialization takes place predominantly outside classroom situations, particularly when you're young. And so in fact, without including these sort of non-official materials, you're sort of getting just the official version of the constructed images of the other. Right, so what we have here is, we've sort of come up with four. Oh, sorry, this is the title of my talk. There. So four categories of Japan as the other. The first is what we call the normative category, or Japan as the normative other. And basically, what it means is that Japan has been used as a model for development or for a sort of alternative modernity for many Asian societies for more than 100 years. So this is something which is not new, and if you're historians among here, you would know that in early 20th century, late 19th century already, Japan has this sort of normative. It becomes an ideal type, normative type within the kind of context of modernization. And this sort of model of Japan giving a distinctive Asian characteristics or Asian root to creating a modern society is something that lives on and obviously goes into the post-war period. And some of the examples that we looked at in our study actually refers to this type. And one of them is going to be discussed by Dr. Christine Han, who is sitting there also from the Institute of Education. And she is going to be talking about Singapore at quite a length, so I'm not going to say very much except to say that in the 1980s, Lee Kuan Yew promoted this policy of Learn from Japan movement, or Learn from Japan campaign. And effectively, Japanese systems of social policy-wise was used as an important normative model for development of Singapore. And interestingly, around the same time, Malaysia, under Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, also decided to adopt a very similar strategy called Learn from the East movement. And this again had very similar ring to the Singaporean program or campaign. But what is very interesting about both of these developments of using Japan as an Asian model, normative model, is the fact that they occurred concurrently with the period of time when the Japanese foreign investment, both official and unofficial, poured into Southeast Asia. So underneath, there is a very strong connection between economics, or the kind of economic foreign policy aspect, and what happens at the social policy level in some of these societies that contribute to the creation of Japan, or particular creation of images of Japan. And another case is in the 1990s, you have in Taiwan, the Japan mania. Some of you may know about this, where everything Japanese became extremely trendy and fashionable and highly covetable. And this includes, this is basically positing Japan as a cultural ideal type rather than an economic ideal type. But still, it sort of makes Japan as some kind of a normative model. Now, the second type is what we call the dominant other. And this is when you have Japan as the most important sort of other as far as country A is concerned. And this enables, well, in fact, this actually makes Japan absolute necessity in terms of trying to categorize or trying to come up with constructions of the identity of the self, i.e., let's say the case of China is a very interesting case because China has increasingly used Japan as the dominant other, not in a positive way, obviously, because Japan is used to pitch against, Japan is given certain national characteristics which actually go against the Chinese sense of themselves, and this becomes very, very kind of prominent from about 1990s onwards. Now, the third type of category is an alternative other. Now, this is quite an interesting category of the other, mainly because it is invoked or invoked to dilute or distract from the historical significance or what are seen to be more threatening dominant foreign presences. So basically, if you have China as the dominant other, then you've got to have Japan as a countervailing force. And this is exactly what happened to Taiwan in the 1990s pro-independence movement type of approach to writing history or rewriting history. And I think today we're not going to be talking very much about that. Maybe through Edward Vickers' talk there, he will mention a bit about this aspect. But it's quite a striking thing that Japan is used as a countervailing force in order to sort of equalize the influence or decrease the influence of the dominant other. And you also see this case in the Malaysian history textbooks, mainly in the Malay language versions of history. Malays use Japan as, well, of course, there is this part about Japan being the enemy other during the Second World War, but quickly Japan loses this kind of negative image. And the Japanese are depicted as the good guys who chased out the Western colonialists out of Malaysia. And however, if you look at the Chinese language textbooks, it's the opposite. The Japanese are the bad guys, and they resolutely remain bad. Because if you look at the Malay version of textbooks, the Malays see the communist Chinese as the #1 enemy. So it depends on who the enemy is, you see, and Japan becomes either good or bad, or not so bad after all, that sort of category. Now the fourth category, sorry. That was the alternative other, and the distant. The fourth category is called the distant other. And this is, I think it's quite obvious from what it's, from the name itself. But we had an example, i.e. the Philippines, which we couldn't really put into any of the three categories because the Philippines represents such an unusual and very interesting example. And basically, in the Philippines, I think Paul Morris is going to be talking a bit about Philippines today. But under the Philippines, both history and popular culture kind of remit, the Japanese, of course, initially they are portrayed as the bad guys, but the image of Japan as the enemy begins to recede already in the late 1950s. And there begins to be other bad people. And they're normally the corrupt Filipino officials. And so, in fact, what you're having is you sort of have another alternative enemy model coming up, and Japan becomes increasingly less relevant to the Filipinos, even within just after a decade after the end of the Second World War. So anyway, these are the four main categories, and I really simplified everything here because I just wanted to give you the overall kind of taste of the kind of papers we had and how we tried to make some sense of these different representations of Japan. But just to conclude, I'd like to say that one thing that you could say is that these four categories are not sort of, they often overlap with each other to a certain extent. So they're not absolute, they're sort of relative categories. And then secondly, of course, if you're talking about East and Southeast Asian societies, and particularly the role of Japan in these societies, you can't talk about Japan without the Second World War, World War II, Pacific War, Sino-Japanese War, whatever you want to call it. And so there is the centrality of the Second World War as, and Japan's role within it that affects greatly the way Japan is portrayed. And then thirdly, I think we can say that we do see this rupture, sort of temporal rupture in the 1990s, when things began to change in many of these societies. And hopefully you'll be able to understand why from the papers that's going to be presented today. So I'm going to end my presentation here, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Christine Han to go next.
Thank you. I'm going to try to do without the mic. Can you hear me at the back, last row? Excellent. Okay. The work I'm presenting is an amalgamation of three people's work. One of Aidan now at Australian National University, myself and Kira Kamsi, the PhD student at the Institute. There's a wonderful volume coming up which you will be told repeatedly about through this thing. Right, Singapore. I don't know why they find out the smallest country first, but it's there. It's tiny. It's not about 6 million, but for a long time it was just about 3 million under. So it's a tiny little place in Southeast Asia. Historically, Singapore started mentioned in the 14th century, became a British colony in the 19th century, and this is the period we're talking about 3 years of Japanese occupation, and then the rest of modern history. But this is the period we're talking about. We looked at textbooks, and this is an example of one of the textbooks we looked at. Actually, on a front page here, this woman was a victim of torture during occupation. Right. Why was Japanese history introduced? When I was growing up in Singapore in the 70s and 80s, we did very little Japanese history, Second World War. There were stories about Limbo Seng that I'll mention later, who was tortured by the Japanese, but that was about it. And there wasn't much really history, or, especially Second World War history. But this really came in, on a large scale, on a big scale, in the 90s, and there was a reason for this, there was a context in which this happened. This is Lee Hsien Loong, current Prime Minister. When he was the Deputy Prime Minister, he said this. He said, many Singaporeans, especially pupils and younger Singaporeans, know little about our recent history. They do not know how we became an independent nation, how we triumphed against the long odds, how Singapore's peaceful and prosperous country, Singapore, came about. I guess you start getting an idea of what they had in mind. This is not the study of history as history, but this is something else. It is contextualized within a particular understanding.
Could you use the mic, please?
You can't hear me?
Yeah, we can't really hear you back here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Is this better? Is this better?
It might be better to hold the mic as you walk around.
Okay. So it's contextualized within. Okay, I'll repeat it again. This is not the study of history as history. It's really about a particular interpretation of history, specifically the interpretation of the political elite in the country. And you will see as I go on, the history of Singapore, including the Japanese occupation, is within this thing called national education, which is meant to develop certain things: national cohesion, confidence in Singapore's future, fostering young sense of identity, rootedness to the country, to know the Singapore story, to teach the Singapore story, Singapore story, including, and it is in this context that you get this, the 3 years of the Japanese occupation. When Singaporeans suffered a traumatic experience of cruelty, brutality, hunger, and deprivation. Just in this context, So it is clear from this kind of context that Singapore history is meant to serve certain purposes, certain aims and intentions. It is really not the study of history as history. I think that as you get to the higher levels in upper secondary, where history is an option for O levels, the examinations, then it becomes more like that, as a study of history. But at the lower levels, where it's compulsory, that the textbooks we're looking at, it's studying history for a particular intention. So what's the Singapore story, right? It's about Singapore's modern history, how it's founded when some British guy came to Singapore, and the period of colonization, Japanese occupation, and then post-war history, self-governance, merger, independence, and so on, right? And it's all about security, economic, and social issues. If the term the Singapore story sounds familiar, it might be because you have heard of this. Lee Kuan Yew, former Prime Minister of Singapore, has a book called The Singapore Story. And that's the term that's used in textbooks. It's very widely used, right? And it's really the interpretation of history by the political elite. There's a recent book in which some scholars were actually interviewing people who lived through the war. And they began to realize that actually the accounts they were giving were startlingly familiar to the kind of account that you get in a book like this. And it's almost as if this narrative has become so dominant that even when people remember things, they remember it as told, you know, in the official narrative. So what we did was that we looked at history textbook. I'll start with textbook first, and then I'll look briefly at a wider kind of economic and social example of Japan. History textbooks look at history and social studies and primary, lower secondary, which is the compulsory level, and 80s, 90s, and 20s to see what the changes were over the years. These are the main topics, right? Context and background of the war, the cause of the war, life during the occupation, the end of the war, and occupation and remembrance of war. And we found certain things. We found that where the context was concerned, over the years between the 80s to the noughties, there was a decrease in 28 percentage points. When it came to the course of the war, an increase of 7 percentage points. Life during occupation, increase in 10 percentage points. And
I'm sorry, what decreased and what increased?
Sorry, the percentage points in terms of coverage.
Percentage of coverage of what?
Of these topics, the context of the war.
In the books?
In the books.
Okay.
So what you get here, if you just look across, usually as opposed to studying history as history, this is very important because it teaches young people about how the war came about and why the Japanese felt motivated, obliged to do these things. But this is the greatest decrease, whereas the other bits about the suffering and the experience of war, the trauma of war, has increased. So it's less about the study of history and understanding history, and more about an articulation of a certain narrative of common experience of suffering and war and occupation. And that's what we emphasized between the 80s and the noughties in the textbooks. We found, Katrina and I found 3 themes: causes of the fall of Singapore, collaboration, resistance, and suffering. And I'll just go through what young people are told in these. With regard to cause of the fall of Singapore, they talk about how effective the Japanese army is, about how loyal they are. Effectiveness, here you have a picture of the Japanese cycling into Singapore. And the idea here is that they are very clever, and they've outsmarted the Brits, who are expecting them to attack some other way, and therefore ineffectual Brits, clever Japanese army, you know, outwitted the British. They're loyal to the king and country and emperor, and that's why they're successful, they're brave, they're strong. The language is very active, whereas the British always presented in very passive kind of language. They're in control, merciless, brutal, cruel, clever. Here's a picture of the Japanese in action, fighting in a battle. Can't say much about the artistic style, but there you are. Collaboration and resistance. I mentioned earlier on that when I was growing up, this was the one person we learned about, Lim Bo Seng. He was a businessman who supported, I think he supported the Republican Party in China. And when the war came, he was very brave. He was a member of the resistance, and he was tortured to death, and he did not reveal the information the Japanese wanted. But he's Chinese. But now, they're very careful in textbooks to incorporate people from other ethnic groups. Right? Singapore, as you know, is a multi-ethnic society. There's Chinese, there's Malays, there's Indians. And now they're careful to include the story of this guy, for instance, Lieutenant Adnan, who was leading his battalion, or whatever you call it, and he was wounded, but he fought until, even though he was wounded, and he was killed in battle. So there is this concern about making sure that in the war, all the heroes that they're represent come from all the ethnic groups. The other theme is suffering. In suffering, Japanese cruelty is emphasized. I don't know if you're familiar with the Kenpeitai, which is this sort of secret Japanese military police, and they would drag people in to be questioned, and they would torture people, and if they thought you were anti-Japanese, they would put you on lorries and drive you to Hongbul or Changi or something, and everybody machine gun. Sukchin was a Hokkien word, a local Chinese word. It's for cleansing. It's basically meant to cleanse Singapore of anti-Japanese elements. These are mainly Chinese, actually, because the Chinese supported the anti-war efforts in China, either because they were either the communists or the Republicans. So all this cruelty and atrocities that they did. So the vivid images, either in writing or in prose or in pictures of atrocities, beheadings and severed heads being put out and so on. I think I have some pictures here. Well, this is an account of what happens when you are dragged in for questioning. They were dragged into the YMCA building, which Paul loves actually. He stays there all the time. And how they're examined, and people, informers in hoods, point you out. And if you were found guilty, you would be put on lorries and taken to Changi. And this is an account by somebody who was actually there, but was not killed. I mean, they just missed him when they were trying to bayonet people to death, but he survived and then tells the story of what it was like to be there. And if that's not enough, here's a picture of the death railway in Thailand. So this picture of the horrors of war, the kind of suffering that the Japanese inflict on you. They were also violent, selfish, incompetent rulers. And they hated the Chinese. That's the word hate is the word that's used, hated the Chinese. Here's more pictures of suffering. Oh, Japanizing local population, okay? Here you have a picture of this Japanese soldier standing in front of these school children, people being forced to bow to the Japanese as they walked, on the streets. Japanese lessons, and this is what you're supposed to learn. So it was seen as an attack on local culture, local population. The other themes is common suffering. Picture here of people being so desperate they were gathering up grains of rice because they were so hungry. The worthless banana money, and of course the ration card. So all this is about is telling people, right? Look, this is what will happen to you if you don't step up and defend the country. Don't depend on the useless Brits who just put their children and wives on boats and sail off. This is what's going to happen to you. And even an admiring tone, look at them, look at how loyal they are to the country and emperor, and look at how clever they are. So almost as if to say, if we want to retain our freedoms, our culture, our pride, we've got to be like them. We've got to be better than them, cleverer, just as loyal and just as, I don't know who the emperor would be in Singapore, but both a country, and willing to sacrifice our lives for them. The other theme that was stressed was the resilience and resources of the local population. How they made soap and shoe polish. Well, you need shoe polish during occupation, I don't know, but how they make soap and shoe polish out of nothing and mutual help, and irrespective of ethnicity. The other thing you must realize, apart from the fact that Singapore is multi-ethnic, is this. The Japanese treated them quite differently, because when the Japanese came, they were particularly angry with the Chinese for sending aid all those years to China to help the anti-Japanese activities there. So they treated the Chinese particularly badly in Singapore and the Malays and Indians less so. But again, you see, that's not emphasized at all. I mean, they're constantly told there was mutual help regardless of people's ethnicities. So you have here you have an account of history being used in a particular sort of way, being used to unify, being used to urge people to be loyal, to be willing to defend their country, urging people to be, as clever and as loyal and as willing to sacrifice themselves as the enemy. There is a context of this which I started off with, and it's because it's a moral panic. Yeah, the belief of the little elite is that the young people are ignorant of Singapore history, they don't have commitment. So history is being used to undergird the messages here, right? You must know about history and how Singapore came to succeed against the odds and all those things, and you must be committed and to underscore the national cohesiveness that regardless of all the differences, all the ethnic groups were equally united. And it's also about the vision of the elite for Singapore, what they want Singapore to be like. So using this history to sort of undergird what they want to see in young people. And this is not only in education, that was is in education. There was a period in which the Japanese were used as a model. You know, we saw then the Japanese being a dominant other, a dominant archetypal historical enemy that Singapore has to confront and defend itself against. It is also a normative other in the sense that you have to be like them to a certain extent if you want to retain your freedom and to be people like them. Japan was also a normative other beyond education. In the 70s, 80s, it was used in the economy, in social reform, if you like, in the Learn from Japan campaign. And here you have, I think, a picture of an official visit of the former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew to Japan. Again, there was a context to this. The context was the oil shock of the 70s, the need to for economic restructuring, and also the fear of militant labor, more militant than they are now. The other thing which, if any of you were there in the 70s and go to Singapore now, the incredible urbanization of the place. I mean, I was living in a place with a huge compound, you know, and we were all moved. You know, we knew everybody, my neighbors in front, behind, and we were all moved with the compensation into blocks of flats. And then you started to triple lock the door because you didn't really know your neighbors. And so there was an uprooting of community and so on, which caused concerns. So against this background, I suppose the government was looking around for ideas. The other fear was this. The other fear was the fear of militant labor, I suppose. And this thing that people were becoming more individualistic. And therefore, whose fault it is? It is the West. It is the individualistic West. So we don't want people to be like that. We want people who are willing to build the country, who will be willing to put the society above itself, that sort of idea. Guess who they look to? Here's Lee Kuan Yew saying, we must make a concerted effort and sustained effort at inculcating in young Singaporeans the virtues of group discipline and the overriding call to society upon the individual rights. And more, otherwise more and more will be consciously influenced by the concepts of Europeans and Americans that rights and liberties of individuals are the first charge of society. So this is not what they want, and they want something else, a different model that they believe would be more suitable for their plans to develop Singapore socially, economically, and as a nation. So they looked to Japan, and I think it coincided with a period in which there was a growth of interest, and Japan wasn't always considered, you know, positively. I think in the 70s there was this book, Japan's Economic Power, and there was a fear of too much dependence on Japan in the region. There was also the issue of the blood debt. There was a lot of building works from the 70s onwards, especially, and people began digging up mass graves, people who had been killed, and there was a great deal of public anger, so that Lee Kuan Yew actually went to Japan and demanded this blood debt to be paid. It was eventually paid, actually. But from the 70s onwards, there began a new revision of views towards Japan. And it's people like Ezra Vogel, for instance. You know, Japan is number one. People like Charles Johnson and so on. And they were invited to Singapore to ask how Singapore should emulate Japan. You know, should replicate Japanese bureaucracy, Japanese thrift, you know, government, business cooperation, and long-term planning, this sort of thing. So things like the productivity movement was imitated. How to be people, you know, coming to Singapore to teach Singaporeans how to be productive. I remember being hauled into quality control circles, you know, at my SME government thing every week to discuss in quality control circles how to improve things, you know. So it was about learning from the Japanese how to do things better, how to be more productive. I'll just zip through these, running out of time. The other thing was the koban. As with many other countries, policemen would work from police stations, but they decided to introduce the koban. So you would have police posts near each block of flats, and you have policemen who are supposed to be be friendly with children, sit there smiling at you and show you directions and help you push cars if they break down, you know, this sort of thing. Just being friendly neighborhood and sort of being part of the community. This didn't last very long because even as a child, it seemed to me to be kind of artificial. But it was part of at the time, of looking to Japan and learning from them, learning different way of doing things. So to summarize, images of Japan, whether it's from education or from economic and social reform, is a historical enemy both to be repulsed and to emulate. And it's not Japan as the enemy, it's Japan as, you know, an enemy, as a possible enemy almost. It's also a social and economic model from Asia without the kind of individualism that you might get from the West. It's a cure for social ills, a kind of propaganda, and it's an ideological device. It's used to underpin the kind of ideology that the political elite had. And Simon has this very nice phrase, learning about Japan is really about teaching people to be productive, patriotic, and compliant Singaporeans. It was really not being about learning from Japan to be Japanese or to be like them, but about a particular vision that the political leaders had for Singapore and Singaporeans. And it was used to underpin, it is used to underpin the kind of vision that they have, the kind of Singaporeans that they want. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul Morris. I'll be covering Hong Kong and trying also to cover the Philippines because, although that's not my speciality, but I'll try and include it because it is an extremely interesting case. In the case of both Hong Kong and the Philippines, I'll be focusing on school textbooks and how they've changed in terms of the images of Japan, and I'll also be saying a few words about popular comics in the Philippines. Now, just by way of very quick background to contextualise it, Hong Kong, British colony for a long time, returned to China in '97, highly capitalistic, school curriculum characterised by being highly depoliticised. It became a special administrative region since '97 at the PRC. That's especially significant because since 1997 there's been a very strong and conscious effort to, in a sense, bring back Hong Kong back into the fold of China and try to ensure that their national identity in Hong Kong is basically a Chinese national identity as defined by the mainland. In the context of the mainland, of course, you had as a sort of state ideology for a long time communism, Maoism, and in that context the national enemies weren't Japan, they were in fact America and capitalism. It's actually since the 80s you've seen the emergence of Japan much more strongly in school curricula. Mid-80s you have the ending of the Cold War, and of course with the ending of the Cold War the nation needs new friends, enemies and foes, and that's precisely what we see going on looking at Hong Kong. Now, what I was looking at in school textbooks is essentially these points. Have to explain though that history is taught in Hong Kong schools through two subjects. History, which is roughly world history, but it includes local history, i.e. Hong Kong history, and Chinese history, which is 5,000 years of unbroken lineage. Right? These subjects don't really talk to each other, they have different pedagogies and very different approaches. Various attempts to merge them have always failed. All right? Now, history, the 3 dates are chosen because these are dates in which there were significant changes to the syllabi and the textbooks consequently. So history, 1996, which represents essentially what was in the textbooks prior to the handover, and then these 2 dates post 97. Chinese history, 93 before the handover and 2 dates afterward. But those dates are different because the times when the syllabus and the textbooks changed were different. Okay, so this is what I'm comparing. We also briefly looked at other textbooks because, you know, there might be massive variation between them. Interestingly, unlike the situation in China, there isn't a great deal of variation in the textbook content we found within Hong Kong. Okay, so we're looking at really the nature of the content, the depictions, portrayal, and the messages that pupils are expected to learn. Now, world history, these are the four, if you like, main topics within which coverage of Japan is included, and these are the number of pages at those 3 points in time, the first point being pre-97, then 2 points afterwards. I wouldn't take massive notice of the number of pages, the coverage, because there were two other things going on at the same time. One is you had a shift to an increased focus on 20th century history in world history, and secondly you had a shift from a 7-year school system to a 6-year system, which means it's really difficult to make comparisons of coverage. Okay, so taking these four topics, please, I'll just briefly go through, and my apologies for going fairly quickly, but I don't usually have to include the Philippines. But on modernisation, the early texts were very clear. Japan is portrayed as a highly successful modernising nation, the first non-Western nation to successfully modernise, successfully learn from the West. They talk about strong leadership and a great deal of focus on the Meiji Restoration, and, for example, 10 key historical characters include 2 Japanese who are central to leading the Meiji Restoration in that early 1996 coverage. So, and in fact, I recently spoke to a professor of history in London who did all his secondary schooling in Hong Kong, and he said, well, in the 80s, all I remember about Japan when I studied at school, Japan equals modernisation. I don't remember anything else. That was the key message. It was the great Asian modernizer. But then from 2004, you get a very distinct shift. It becomes modernization is linked very strongly to a process of preparing for invasion and militarism, right? It's part of a portrayal of sort of Japan as a pathological, inveterate, militaristic nation, and modernization is, if you like, just part of that process. And so, for example, whereas in this book 2 key figures, historic, very positive figures, were characters involved with the Meiji Restoration, now the important figures were 2 people who were portrayed very negatively because they'd been involved in the Sino-Japanese War. Okay, so you have a distinct shift to reducing this focus that there was early on modernization. However, in contrast, the focus on militarism grows quite markedly, and so in '96, Japan is sort of portrayed as, especially in terms of the build-up to the Second World War, 1930s onwards, as sort of part of a broad rise of fascism globally. There's a stress on the international context and also reference to sort of a period of democracy. Then from 2004 on, and there's also here comparisons with China's own self-strengthening movement, which was relatively unsuccessful. And from here we have the comparisons with China disappear, and there's a very strong focus on all aspects of life in Japan, including education being a preparation for sort of promoting nationalism and militarism. So Japan is no longer a model of modernization, and and militarism is seen as part of a sort of long, unbroken narrative going back a very long period. So we have a very distinct shift in the message. This topic, post-World War, reconstruction, development, it wasn't covered in '96, but the shift into more 20th century history, we see the major shift coming in 2009, which focuses on interestingly, more modern, the economic success of modern Japan for a period, and then quite a lot of stress on Japan's economic success being a function of it having effectively a one-party state led by the LDP. There seems to be a message there for Hong Kong school children, but I'll pick that up in a minute. But there's a great deal of concern expressed as to increased defence spending, constitutional change. The Yasukuni Shrine gets detailed coverage in many places, visits to, and a portrayal of Japan as being a concern for many countries in Asia. Right? It's not just sort of China or Hong Kong that are worried about it. And then this is an example of a quotation I think has some similarities to what Christine said. It's sort of trying to say something, Japan as an example, to say something to Hong Kong youth. Concern about individualism, and essentially Japan has got problems because it's doing things that some people want us to do in Hong Kong as well.
Well, it's bemoaning the decadence of contemporary Japan. Japan was far better when it was a one-party state like China is now, basically.
Right. And then this topic, post-war relations with other countries. 2004, very strong stress on American influence, very strong. And then 2009, we have a shift to essentially China creating a number of problems in the region, right? And Japan's responsible for relations with China. The Yasukuni Shrine comes in again, territorial disputes. Japan's trade deficit with China seems to be a problem for some reason. But it stresses that the tensions across East Asia, that they're essentially sort of located as a problem caused by Japan. And you can see the sorts of questions that pupils are asked to answer that are fairly leading in their nature. Right. Okay, moving on please quickly to the other subject, Chinese history. 3 topics that cover relations with Japan. Japan's invasion of China. I say these are the pages that changed over the 3 textbook editions, but taking Japan's invasion. What you see in the early history textbook was a series of incidents that resulted in war. Right? This happened at the bridge, and then this happened, and then war broke out. Just as with, in a sense, the world history, there's now, from 2005 onward, the focus is on a sort of continuing militarism. How did Japan set about gradually invading China from the early 30s? It's a sort of teleology now, and we have a number of new topics introduced. Increased coverage of the Nanjing massacre, primarily through many more photographs, and the use of terminology from the mainland. The other topic, all-out resistance against Japan invasion. It only appeared in the syllabus from 2005 and added this topic, Japan's fierce attack on China's rear base. I say mainland historical terminology is now being used. KMT is recognised, but actually in Hong Kong textbooks, the role of the KMT in fighting against Japan in the Sino-Japanese War has always been recognised. It's only recently appeared in textbooks in the mainland. The US role's massively reduced. In a list of reasons why Japan eventually won the war against... Japan eventually were thrown out of China. It used to start that the second reason was a support from the Allies, especially the Americans. That's now become at the bottom of the list, right? And it's the bravery and the good high morale of the Chinese troops that's now the first factor. The locals being reduced. There's no role for that there used to be in the textbook of the resistance within Hong Kong. That's gone. And again, Yasukuni makes a third appearance, right? So we've got a number of factors that aren't, 5 minutes? Number of factors that aren't mentioned, and so it's generally most important to sort of shift from modernisation to focus on militarism, and a pathological long-term militarism at that. Moving on very quickly, sorry about this, to the Philippines. As Noko has indicated, it's a fascinating case because the Philippines has always been a nation that's had difficulty promoting any sense of national identity. Its experience with Spanish and then American colonization and a brief period of Japanese occupation. In the 1950s, it was the country that was thought to be most virulently anti-Japanese in the post-war period. That declined very quickly, and possibly something to do with economic aid, but it is covered as a topic, but it's not unlike Singapore or Hong Kong, where in Hong Kong it seems to be being used as a common period which both mainland and Hong Kong children might have a sort of period of shared suffering, common history. In the Philippines, periods of colonization are not really described in the normal way that countries use such periods to construct a sense. There isn't a national narrative, a national story. For example, national heroes like Rizal attempts to put his books into the school curriculum in the 1950s and 60s were vetoed by the Catholic Church. Right? In textbooks, Americans are referred to as accidental colonizers. Right? In surveys of pupils' identity, Filipinos, the majority of them say they would prefer to be Americans or Japanese. So national identity is a difficult construct in the Philippines, and this is really reflected in the coverage of the Japanese. They appear as they appear as cartoon type characters, right? And it's often, as Noko indicated, it's collaborators with the Japanese who are the significant enemy other, right? And those who actually resisted the Japanese in the Philippines are referred to in textbooks as bandits. So it's a very strange story, and I say it might have something to do with economic aid. Just to sort of pick up, please, so they don't actually talk about colonization, and the coverage is significantly reduced over the last 15, 20 years. If there's one message coming through about the Japanese and Japanese invasion, is that it delayed the Philippines getting independence from America, right? That's actually the title of a chapter, that, you know, the Japanese delayed Philippine independence, and it's the Americans who are portrayed as the heroes. There are no named Filipino heroes, although of course many people did lose their lives. There's a great deal of allocation of unnamed collaborators. The more affluent collaborators from the elite, though, are thought to have done that for selfless to help their community. Very differential coverage. Just, it's quite different, this coverage of the Japanese occupation in the Philippines to any of the other countries. And if I might just pick up on some of the comics, you have a shift here, which I'll go through very quickly. The comics if you look at the date here, 1946, the Japanese are portrayed as cartoon characters, very, very bad haircuts, moustaches, speak very bad English. They really are. It's quite a simple portrayal. Then you have the emergence, and the heroes all look like American cowboys. Right, you will notice. Then you have coming into the pictures, actually, you have the caricatured evil Japanese, but you also have some, there is somewhere in here a good Japanese, and the good Japanese always speaks excellent English, Tagalog, and is very well educated and handsome. Okay, then you have, and now that was 1966, and similar pit, 59, you have the focus of the comics not on the Japanese as the enemy, but on local bandits. Right, they become the key baddies. Oops, sorry, something's happening here. I think though I'm going to have to stop at that point. Am I running out of time? I am. Thank you very much.
Right, I'm going to talk about portrayals of Japan in a couple of large national state-run history museums in Beijing and in Taiwan. Now, if you've been to China or Taiwan recently, you may have noticed that there's been a sort of upsurge in the construction of museums in recent years of various types. These are both state-run museums, as I said. This is the one in Beijing, and you can see, I think from this picture, it's a sort of, still a sort of Soviet-inspired, quite overbearing feel that you get as you enter the exhibition there. This is the museum in Taiwan, in Tainan, southern Taiwan, the National Museum of Taiwan History. This is a new museum, newly opened in 2011, and you can see this is a much more sort of touchy-feely, people-centered sort of exhibition. This museum actually has a longer genealogy. This is the old Museum of Revolutionary History, housed in the building on the east of Tiananmen Square, which also houses what used to be the Museum of Chinese History, now combined as the National Museum of China. So this exhibition was revamped and reopened in 2011. Now, historically on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, museums and other aspects of cultural policy have been quite heavily supervised by the state throughout the modern period. And very briefly and very crudely, there are perhaps three reasons for this, or three legacies that help account for this. One is the legacy of Confucian state, so-called Confucian state-centered historiography, the assumption that the state should have a role in writing history, defining the correct vision of history. The second, again, broadly speaking, is the Leninist legacy, and it's important to bear in mind that not only the Communist Party of China, but also the Kuomintang were Leninist parties. But thirdly, I think we need to bear in mind the legacy of Japan when it comes to the construction of a modern narrative of the nation in China. Early Chinese historians or Chinese nationalist historians in the early 20th century very much used Japanese templates for writing the history of China, for writing a history of the Chinese nation, rather than simply histories of Chinese dynasties or emperors. And that template, that sort of way of thinking about the nation and the national story, I think remains very influential to this day. And on Taiwan, of course, as well, not only through the sort of influence of Japanese precedents on the Kuomintang, but also through the direct influence of Japan on Taiwan during the colonial period. So, historically, as I said, museums in Taiwan and in mainland China have very much been vehicles for official visions of national identity, but what sort of identity? And I'm going to look at this question through the way in which the museums treat Japan. But again, for reasons of time, very briefly, there are, of course, a number of ways of conceiving of national identity, and these are dimensions that are significant, have been significant in China and indeed on Taiwan. I can say a bit more about these later if necessary. In terms of culture, of course, Confucius nowadays is hailed as a sort of unifying symbol of the Chinese, or at least of the Han nation, but slightly controversially. In mainland China, at least, this is the statue out the front of the museum that I'm talking about. Well, it's not as far out the front as it was originally. It's been relegated to an inner courtyard after protests from certain factions within the party. Now, especially recently with respect to Taiwan, culture has become, as we'll see, a sort of dividing factor in the sense that elements, particularly separatist elements within Taiwan, have tried to emphasize the cultural differences with mainland China, and Japan has served a very useful purpose in this respect. This is the National Museum of Taiwan Literature, also in Tainan, which is housed in a lovingly restored Japanese colonial building. National heroes, again, are another way in which identity is represented or symbolized. And this is an interesting example of such a figure, Zheng Chenggong, who, depending on your point of view, is a Chinese national hero, a Taiwanese national hero, or a half Japanese pseudo-national hero. Again, other symbols of national identity. A particularly significant dimension of the construction of modern identities in China, as on Taiwan, relates to the modernization project itself, and the sort of subject or agent of that project, which of course is crucially the national people, but also, especially still in mainland China, the party itself, the Communist Party. And the museum that I'm looking at, the National Museum of China, or at least the modern section of it, is very much a party museum. So here, very briefly, you see the sort of pattern of the narrative of the modernization project. I'll try and let the pictures speak for themselves. And this pattern is really, in most respects, quite similar to the way in which the Kuomintang formerly represented its own role in the modernization of the nation. This is again back to the National Museum of China, the way in which Taiwan is represented. Now, in terms of Japan's role in this narrative of the construction of modern nationhood, certainly in the case of the Chinese narrative, Japan's main role is as the sort of obstacle, or a chief obstacle to the modernization project, as the sort of primary author of the Chinese nation's victimhood or humiliation, and as an obstacle that therefore needed to be transcended in the search for modern Chinese nationhood. Now this is a key theme not only of the Communist Party narrative, but also of the classic Kuomintang narrative of modern Chinese history. But it's a pattern that that broadly has been taken on by some of those activists associated with the Taiwanese independence movement. And one quite prominent Taiwanese historian said to me several years ago, when I was talking to him about the sort of controversies over history within Taiwan in recent years, that if you look at some of the early textbooks produced in the late 90s, early 2000s on Taiwan history, they adopt a sort of narrative of Taiwan and Taiwanese as victims, and of the story of Taiwan as overcoming victimhood, transcending this victimhood, which in certain ways is very similar to the sort of narrative structure that was adopted in the old Kuomintang textbooks, except that the subject has shifted from China to Taiwan. In fact, he said to me, it's as if they've sort of taken the old story and just replaced the word China with the word Taiwan. Now, both the, well, to illustrate this, there's agreement across the strait on one thing regarding modern Taiwanese history, which is that after the end of the war with Japan, Taiwanese people joyfully celebrated reunion with the motherland. But then, of course, the separatist or the sort of pro-independence vision of history, as represented here in the 228 Peace Memorial Museum in Taipei, departs drastically from the mainland narrative, depicting Taiwan very much as a sort of victim of the Chinese Kuomintang. So, in the narrative of Taiwanese victimhood, the agent of, or the sort of victimizer of Taiwan is not the Japanese, but China. So, essentially, in terms of both China and Taiwan and their respective struggles against foreign oppression, particularly since the early 1990s, as the Communist Party in China has moved patriotism to the center of its sort of ideological legitimating strategy, Japan has featured more and more centrally as the target of anti-foreign nationalism. But in Taiwan, the picture has been rather different. Now, I want at this point to sort of sound a health warning, if you like. My impression of the media coverage in Japan at the moment of, in particular, anti-Japan nationalism in China, is that at least the mainstream media in Japan appears to, and many prominent politicians, appear to believe that anti-Japanese nationalism in China is very much a sort of product of propaganda, that simply it's a consequence of brainwashing. The Communist Party has manufactured this narrative, which is it's sort of pummeling into the heads of the Chinese people for its own nefarious purposes. Now, of course, there's an element of truth in that, perhaps more than an element, as we'll see. But I think we need to consider why propaganda, when it is successful, is successful. And if you take the case of Taiwan, for decades after 1945, Taiwanese were pummeled with Kuomintang propaganda, telling them that they were Chinese, or should be patriotic Chinese, and Taiwan was an irrelevance. The national capital was, or the center of the nation was across the strait on the mainland. And it didn't have much effect, because it didn't really correspond with the lived experience of Taiwanese people or the folk memories that many Taiwanese people or their families had. Whereas, because of the experience of some of the experiences of Taiwanese society in the post-war period, a certain amount of nostalgia for the period of Japanese rule did arise amongst the sort of native Taiwanese community, which subsequently pro-independence groups in Taiwan have been able to exploit. So the narratives that we'll see and the depictions of Japan that we'll see in these museums, insofar as they do appeal to substantial sections of society in mainland China or in Taiwan, appeal because there is something there to appeal to. Yeah, they're not simply, I would argue, not simply sort of fantasies constructed out of thin air by ruling parties in either case. So here's the National Museum of China, or some illustrations of the way that Japan appears in the National Museum of China. These paintings, you can see this painting is in very much the same style as this one. These paintings feature quite prominently in the National Museum of China exhibition, as they, and they always have done ever since it opened in the early 60s. But the more modern paintings, or the ones newly created for the exhibition when it reopened in 2011, several of these highlight Japanese atrocities. Taiwan, insofar as it appears in this exhibition, appears only in relation to Japanese invasion and colonization and the heroic resistance of the Taiwanese people to this. There's no coverage at all, either in this museum or in any other museum I've seen in China, of the sort of internal development of Taiwan. And here's another new painting relating to the war with Japan. The title sort of says it all, but if you look in the top left-hand corner, you can see a picture of you can see the Chinese soldiers are carrying the Kuomintang flag. And this is an illustration of the way in which the theme of the war with Japan has been used very much in the last 2 decades to emphasize the unity of the Chinese people. The Chinese people were united in their struggle against Japan, that this was a sort of foil for the formation of a sense of united national identity. Yes, again in relation to Taiwan, the museum, the National Museum of China, claims that Taiwanese people were part of this united struggle against Japan, whereas of course the vast majority of Taiwanese who fought in the war fought for Japan, not against it. So from the communist point of view, Taiwan is very much the first Chinese victim of Japan's invasion and colonization efforts in relation to China, whereas for pro-independence Taiwanese, for many of them, Taiwan is a sort of victim of many different victimizers. And we can see the salience of this narrative of victimhood in one of the museum I showed you earlier, also in Tainan, the National Museum of Taiwan Literature. These are the sort of main titles of the sections of the exhibition. This is a museum that was set up about 10 years ago. During the period of DPP rule, it opened. And this is an example of the oldest museum in Taiwan. Well, this is the oldest museum in Taiwan, opened in 1909. A Japanese institution which languished under the Kuomintang until the 1990s, but that was then refurbished. And it's just one example of the sort of nostalgia for the Japanese heritage that you see in Taiwan today. So the National Museum of Taiwan History, the permanent exhibition is divided into these 6 themes. Now, the Chinese don't actually appear until about the middle of the exhibition as the sort of key influence on Taiwanese society and culture. Early residents refers to the Aboriginal population, sort of Malay, Polynesian. The disparate cultures referred to in the second section include, well, the Aborigines, the Chinese, but also the Dutch, other Europeans, and the Japanese. But the main treatment of Japan is in the penultimate section, which is also the largest section in the museum and sort of sits right in the middle of the permanent exhibition. This is Japan in the early section. This is the main section on Japan, and within this section, the sort of central space is occupied by a reconstruction of a Japanese koban, or police station, local police station. This is the most popular place in the museum for visitors to have their photographs taken. You sit down and stick your arms around these 2 dummy Japanese policemen, or do this. The section on the Japanese occupation of Taiwan very much emphasizes the positive, constructive contribution of Japan to Taiwan's development, the sort of scientific, rational nature of the Japanese colonial exhibition. And this is another example of a sort of colonial scientific enterprise, the anthropological study and cataloguing of Taiwanese Aborigines in particular, in which incidentally this institution, the Colonial Museum, played a key part. It also emphasizes the modernization of the economy, particularly the agricultural sector, by the Japanese, construction of modern infrastructure, and the bringing to Taiwan of a modern system of education, liberation of women by Japanese colonizers. These things, of course, are relative. And the introduction of the earliest representative institutions. And then we come to the war. Now, the war is treated in a very interesting way, I think, in this museum, insofar as the focus is very much on the impact of the Pacific War on Taiwanese people, meaning people within Taiwan itself. So here we see a Taiwanese family sort of bidding farewell to their son who's going off to fight in the war. But we're not told anything about what Taiwanese who fought in the war did. Nothing at all. If you go down the road to the Showakan here in Tokyo, you'll see a pretty much identical treatment of wartime society. It's all about what happened to Taiwan as a result of the war, and not what was happening outside Taiwan with the involvement of Taiwanese soldiers or whoever. Nor does the exhibition say anything about the deployment within Taiwan during the war of, for example, prisoners of war, the use of slave labor, anything like that. And this, I think, tells us something about who this museum is meant for. It's meant for the Taiwanese, it's meant for the native Taiwanese. It's not addressing really the mainlander population, or those with mainlander antecedents, who of course, whose ancestors were on the receiving end of the war in which Taiwanese were involved up to 1945. Now, nowadays we have many mainland tourists, visitors courtesy of Ma Ying-jeou's warming of relations. We have many of them popping across the strait for guided tours of Taiwan, but you won't find the National Museum of Taiwan History on the standard itinerary. You'll be amazed to hear, which I think is a shame. But the fact that it's, well, I mean, of course you will find the National Palace Museum in Taipei on the itinerary, precisely because that is an institution created by Chiang Kai-shek to symbolize Taiwan's essential and eternal Chineseness. But what's significant about this, I think, is that within Taiwan now, you'll find an institution like the National Museum of Taiwan History there alongside an institution like the National Palace Museum and other museums like the National History Museum in Taipei. So there are a number of different kinds of museums within the state-funded, state-managed museum sector that provide a sort of different take on the national identity and history. So there's diversity, there's pluralism within that. Of course, under the Democratic Progressive Party regime up until 2008, arguably this was also the case, although in fact I think what was happening then was that the DPP were very uncomfortable with institutions like the National Palace Museum and the National History Museum, and to some extent tried to subvert them and use them to promote Taiwanese identity by putting on various temporary exhibitions. The museums are still a sort of site of political contestation in a similar way, but it's significant that the National Museum of Taiwan History, which presents the vision of Taiwanese identity I've discussed, has been allowed to open under a Kuomintang regime, because there was some doubt in 2008 of whether that would actually ever happen. So to summarize very briefly, in the National Museum of China we still see this very strong sort of victimhood transcendence narrative directed very much or focused very much on the theme of the Japanese invasion. We don't see class struggle at all there now. In Taiwan, whereas this sort of same narrative pattern was quite evident in museums like the 228 Peace Memorial Museum, sort of repackaged for Taiwanese consumption, I think victimhood is a much less salient theme in this new museum. It's in that sense perhaps a more mature portrayal of Taiwanese identity. I won't go through all of these because I don't really have time. Yeah, I think I'll stop and allow time for discussion. But there you are, you can read.
Maybe one of you could please wait for the microphone, and if you could all please use the microphone for your questions, because we are recording this.
Yoshi Yamuto, and I work for the Cabinet Secretariat. I think Professor Shimazu mentioned about the Japanese image in Southeast Asia, that until up to a certain time, maybe 70s or 80s, Japan was seen as a sort of economic model, but later on it was more seen as the cultural model. Is that pretty much a trend that, although maybe after 90s or into 2000s, Japan lost maybe the strength to appeal in the economic dimension, but was it substituted by the cultural dimension, that Japan still remains as a very impressive country to the Southeast Asian countries because of the culture? Or do you think that because Japan lost the economic strength, people in Southeast Asia is losing interest to Japan.
Hi, thanks very much for your question. There are a number of factors. First of all, it is true that the economic decline, relative economic decline of Japan has made an impact in terms of using Japan as a sort of aspiring or aspirational model for these countries, because as I mentioned, there was this undertone, very strong undertone of Japanese economic penetration of East Asia and Southeast Asia, generally speaking, in the 1970s and 80s, has been a significant factor in influencing the creation of these social models and economic model types, which posited Japan as the kind of dominant normative model. But and it's quite interesting what you say, because I think your perspective is that economic model turns into a cultural model type. But there is a very important rupture which occurs in this period, which is the end of the Cold War. And this seems to have an incredible effect on the way the sort of just general kind of geostrategic relationships in the region change, and the fact that the Cold War framework slowly dissolves or disappears or weakens in the region, just generally speaking, and that sort of leaves the kind of hitherto economic model of Japan in a limbo. So that's one thing. But the second thing, the cultural model ideal type, is actually quite complex, because although I mentioned about the Taiwanese case of Japan mania in the 1990s, although, and this is, as you know, it didn't just happen in Taiwan, it happened in Korea and Hong Kong and lots of places in Southeast Asia. When I went to Indonesia, they told me that they have Arashi fan clubs in Jakarta, Jakarta, Surabaya, and all these places. So, but the distinction here, and it's the same with the economic model type, is that Japan, there is Japan as social reality. And then there is Japan as a hyper-reality. So it's not the real Japan that they are aspiring to. So in the Taiwanese study, we found out that all these kind of Japan mania young people who bought into Japanese things, popular cultural things in a very big way, they might actually get disappointed when they come to Japan, because it's not what they thought it would be. So there is this difference between reality and fiction. And it is in some sense a fictionally kind of created images of Japan, which is this kind of wonderful, wonderland image. So I think there is a kind of distinction, and the transition is not the sort of smooth linear one, but there is a sort of temporal rupture in this relation.
Can I just add to that point? I think what we also notice is an amazing tolerance of ambiguity. People can hold multiple conceptions. So, if you take the case of Hong Kong, protesters might be wearing sort of Japanese pop culture T-shirts and protesting over the Diaoyu Islands, or Senkaku Islands. This is not seen to be contradictory. Just as in the same way, very recently, you could have the same people protesting in Hong Kong over the Senkaku Islands issue, but next week be protesting equally strongly against the introduction of national moral education into the school curriculum. Then people can operate in quite different domains, and I think that the cultural and the various models could hold multiple conceptions.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Shohei Sato, University of Tokyo. Thank you very much for the presentations. I was wondering, well, all of these textbooks are pretty much portraying a state-centered history where Japan plays a role as a mirror image. And I was wondering if you try to read against the grain, is there an emergence of an East Asian identity? So, for example, if we delete Japan from this historical map, we will lose one model. That's fine. We have lots of other models to aspire to. We will lose one of the baddies. That's fine. We have lots of other people to hate. We lose one of the friends. That's fine. But then for the East Asians, we will. Isn't it the case that Japan has played a role that in the history, in the memory of the modern history, all of these people, like the Singaporeans, the Chinese, Taiwanese, have significant contact with, and it's not just the Europeans or the Americans. The image was, well, the contrasting image was the African history. If you talk about African identity, is that a unifying factor? Not really. But when you talk about East Asian, the modern history of East Asia, there was, well, to a very unfortunate extent, Japan as like an overarching player, playing different roles at different times. So is there an emergence of an East Asian identity where Japan plays an ambivalent role? Can you detect that from the school textbooks?
I don't think you can detect that in any of the materials I've looked at, but maybe I'm missing something. Recently, at my university, Kyushu University, we had a little sort of one-day symposium with some scholars invited over from Korea, and I gave a sort of much more general presentation introducing the work we've been doing in this project. And one of the Korean academics asked a somewhat similar question about former Prime Minister Hatoyama's warblings about how nice it would be to have some sort of East Asian community along the lines of the European Union. But this Korean academic said, well, you know, what did I think about the relationship between his proposal, Hatoyama's proposal, and the, what was it called, the Daito Kyodo Kyoike, yeah. That's the problem for East Asians. Any such idea of East Asian, for many East Asians, or at least those who read any history, ideas of East Asian unity summon up that vision. Now, of course, the case of the European Union is not entirely different. Mark Mazur, several years ago, wrote a book about what's called Hitler's Empire, in which he pointed out that you can detect some of the roots of the movement towards European unity in wartime Nazi-dominated Europe. In fact, some of the sort of bureaucratic architects of post-war European Union worked for Nazis or the occupation authorities during the war. But the case of East Asia is well, different. I mean, the European Union was constructed largely to contain Germany. How would you construct an East Asian? Well, who are you trying to contain, first of all? You construct an East Asian Union to contain Japan. Well, it would have to involve China. But actually, China's could be the country that is going to take most containing. So who's going to take that on? It's a very different geopolitical situation for that reason, for all sorts of other reasons.
My name is John Day. I'm from the Korean Embassy, and thank you for the very interesting presentation, which helped me a lot in the images of Japan in the context of domestic politics of this country. Professor Shimazu mentioned at the outset that these images of Japan from the outside world have an impact on how Japan sees itself, or perhaps a difference between how Japan sees itself and how the outside world citizen. So was this sort of interaction part of your project, or if you have any views on this? My second question is with regard to the Professor Han's presentation. I think Singapore's experiences rings a bell in my home country. I think you mentioned that there is, on the one hand, Singapore sees that as Japan as an enemy of World War II, and on the other hand, it sees as a normative model. Do you think these two images coexist at the same time, or it has somehow changed? I think Professor Morris somehow answered this partially, but I just would like to know how these two images coexist at the same time. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Thank you very much for your questions. I'm going to obviously answer the first one, which is related to the question of how do the Japanese form the images of the other, and does that have any impact? I suppose that's what you were asking, on the way that the other side form images of Japan. And there is this historical, well, first of all, I'd like to say that there is a very strong kind of synergy, unintentional most of the time, but there is a relationship between the two sides, whatever sides you take. And it is not possible for one side just to create, construct images of the other. There has to be some feeding in of information, propaganda, the past, whatever, that goes into the creation of images of the other. So there is a very strong element of mutuality that can be officially, conducted or unofficially conducted, or I think in many cases it's unintentional. But there is a relationship, first of all, and secondly, Japan has a very strong historical tradition of feeding certain images of Japan to abroad, and this obviously started at least 100 years ago. I'm a historian of early 20th century, so I look at a lot of things in that period. But things like, ideas like Bushido, ideas like, this art of tea ceremony, all these things were actually cultural, if you want to call it propaganda, then it is cultural propaganda, disseminated by the Japanese in the early 20th century. And it came to form very important images of Japan. It helped to form images of Japan, particularly in the West at the time, but also things like the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. The fact of the Japanese winning the war against Russia did feed into a lot of the discourse on Asian modernity in countries like the Middle East, in some of the, even in African territories under British and French occupation at the time. So there is this tradition of the Japanese either sort of by implementing or doing, undertaking a war, creating certain images of itself abroad, and also the Japanese later on documenting those images that the Japanese want to export through writings. So I'm talking about, Nito-des, Bushido, also Sakurai Tadayoshi's Human Bullets. Those two were very, very important. That was from the Russo-Japanese War. They were very important image creation materials for the elite in the West. So similarly, in the post-war period, there is this very strong element of mutuality in image creations.
Thank you for that. That's an interesting question you asked, actually. Can I just say that very quickly? I mean, one reason we talked about this project was because I was doing a seminar in London, and I stupidly handed out textbooks of the war to students, and I stupidly ignorantly put 2 Chinese students and 2 Japanese students at the same table. And the Japanese student said, "Oh, I didn't know Japan was in Singapore." At which point the Chinese student, "Don't you know about the Nanjing massacre? You don't know how many people died and so on." And I was like, World War III. But the reason I was so ignorant was because I wasn't angry with the Japanese, and I was surprised that these Chinese students were so angry, And I think, to your question, I think when I was talking about the kind of social reforms and economic reforms in the 70s, there was a period of amnesia, actually. So history wasn't really taught. And coincidentally, of course, the Japanese were investing hugely in Singapore at the time, so maybe that was a reason for the amnesia. But it seemed to me as if it was almost shelved for a period of time. And this history that I talked about was introduced, in the 90s. So young people nowadays are now getting a bit angry, I suppose, remembering all that kind of horror. But at the same time, you see pop culture. Singapore, as in the rest of East Asia, these young kids, they love J-pop, they love K-pop, they love anime and manga and cosplay and all these kind of things. So I don't know what we're producing actually. On the one hand, they adore, this horror, this sort of Japanese pop culture, Korean pop culture. On the other hand, they're taught this kind of stuff in the classroom. And I really don't know, what we're producing and how they, at the moment I think Paul is right. It's like this sort of ambiguity, sort of, you're almost dual personality. You're different things depending on the subject, and you can be a avid Japan lover and adore everything but Japanese fashion and everything, and then the next minute, then you're this very good nationalist. If the right topic comes up, maybe that's it.
I think it's a very interesting point you raise about the role that Japan plays in the construction of images of itself in other East Asian countries, and of course there's a level on which this is done intentionally through sort of conscious cultural policy. There's also, I think far more significantly, the unintentional role that elements within Japan play in constructing images of Japan overseas. And I think what is too often forgotten within Japan is that is the level of interest in neighbouring East Asian and Southeast Asian countries, but particularly China and Korea, in domestic Japanese debates over Japan's own past, particularly the war, particularly the colonial period. And that's partly because, in one respect, Japan is, or has been, but still is, to a large extent, regarded as a model, regarded as a sort of aspirational model of the kind of modern society that China and Korea themselves could be. But this means that the sort of issues that Paul was showing the Hong Kong textbooks discussing, visits to the Yasukuni Shrine, controversies over history textbooks within Japan, the fact that Tokyo, 5 times, 6 times elected Ishihara Shintaro as mayor. These things are bloody well noticed in China and Korea, and have an enormous impact on the way that Japan is perceived, as you well know, and I think we can't emphasize this enough, because as I said, in the middle of my talk, propaganda needs fuel to work with. And Japan is constantly providing propagandists with that fuel, constantly, and it's been made many times, but this is, I've been cut off. Ishihara. Anyway, this sort of ammunition is constantly being handed out to nationalist propagandists across the water.
Oh, okay.
He's coming.
Thank you for great presentation. I'm very interested in images and citizens' feeling or people's feeling in those countries. Actually, for example, during World War II, during Cold War, Japanese people's feeling against China is very, very good. Actually, after making the national relationship, we think China is a kind of Chinese image is panda. Many people also go to the zoo to see panda. So at that time, very good image. But after World War II, because of maybe World Framework, Japanese people feeling, changed. Maybe because of the territorial issue, and maybe textbook problem. But what influenced most to the citizens' images or feelings? For example, history because maybe, sorry, but probably during World War II or before World War II, Japan and some Asian countries had a very kind of bad history, like as a massacre, like that. But because of that, or territorial issue, I think so. I'm very interested in that. What is a big factor or biggest factor in the like that?
We have a mic right in front of you.
Should we ask
Should
some
we
more
take some more
questions
questions before?
given time?
Yeah, actually, we have 10 minutes, so we have
Yeah.
maybe an opportunity for 2 more questions.
I'm not sure this is going to fit easily, but I think you can get over it really quickly. There's an expression in Japanese that says that children learn from behind their parents' backs. It's not what they're told to do, it's the way they see that things are done. And I'm a TV cameraman, director, producer, whatever, so I'm very aware of manufacturing consent and the role of propaganda and how all of this official image or spread popular image. But there's also so much happening right now in the world through social media, just things that suddenly are cropping up where the control mechanism or the official line is suddenly not working. But basically your study is about the official line, so I'm not sure that my question really fits, but that's my question.
I'm sorry to use the bully pulpit to follow up on that question, but what we're dealing with here in the countries you've been dealing with, perhaps with the exception of Philippines, are authoritarian states that maybe have the ability to control propaganda and the kind of messages that are being sent out. But in other societies, for instance in Japan, in 2003 when Japan co-hosted the World Cup with Korea, there was a Korea boom, there was a tremendous amount of interest in Korea. At the same time, at a state level, you have these belligerent politics, people like Ishihara. You see this with China as well. At a state level, you have very negative portrayals of China, but China's the largest trading partner, and most Japanese, when they are tourists, they go to China. So you have these kind of cross currents between popular culture and state level politics. So I wonder if you could address that as part of it.
Siegfried Niedel, freelancer from Germany. I think the Japanese government every time thought if time goes by, the history will forgotten. Not, it didn't happen. It's now more present than 20 years ago. It's an enigma for me. Why does it come now more than 20 years or 30 years ago?
Can I maybe try a partial answer to the last question? I first noticed, and I think I tried to pick it up in my talk, that both in China and Hong Kong, coverage of Japan in the way we've depicted is really sort of, you're talking about mid-1980s, where it's getting prominence. And so your point, history isn't going away. Right? It is being recycled and repackaged, and as states sort of are in the constant process of constructing national identity, and something I would say in the case of China, at the end of the Cold War was critical, right? Because the old significant others, the friends and the foes, had to change, right? It wasn't capitalism anymore. It wasn't America, right? And I think Japan, in a sense, filled that vacuum very easily. I think in terms of the other question, which is really 2 or 3 people have raised it, yes, we are talking, well, actually the book doesn't. The book is quite balanced between culture and state-controlled messages through schools and textbooks and, as Ed has illustrated, museums. I don't, in the end, it's some sort of interaction, right, between multiple sources. It is clear that states aren't always effective, right? But it's also equally clear, and if you travel in China, for example, or meet young Chinese students, their understanding of Japan is clearly very strongly and powerfully influenced by the sorts of messages that they've learned through schools. But they're also able to reconcile those, right, and with, you know, a love of aspects of the culture. You know, there's this sort of tolerance of ambiguity, and it's not singular in a sense how children, young people view other nations. It's quite complex.
Well, one question which we've already discussed is or I've already alluded to, is why particular kinds of propaganda are successful in particular societies at particular times. But in terms of the relationship between the state and popular culture and popular memory or popular images of Japan, we are dealing, I think, in East Asia with different kinds of states. And so at one end of the spectrum you have perhaps, well, okay, North Korea, but we haven't discussed that. You have a sort of authoritarian society like China, where there is a sort of very strong set of state messages promoted by the state through a variety of media. And then at the other end of the spectrum you have a society like the Philippines, where the state is extremely weak, and that's reflected, I think, in the perhaps the sort of weakness or vagueness of the images of Japan that are portrayed through school textbooks in the Philippines, or the sort of lack of a concerted sort of state-led effort to use images of Japan to construct a cohesive narrative of Filipino-ness. Sorry, yes?
I was just going to ask to speak after you.
Oh, right, okay. But I mean, even in China, where you have this strong state, where you have a strong set of messages, there is, as a gentleman here mentioned, the rise of sort of social media, of media that at least ostensibly is not directly controlled by the state. And there, of course, you find even stronger, often even stronger anti-Japanese sentiments that you find in state propaganda itself. Just as in Hong Kong, which is not controlled, at least not directly, by the Communist Party, you find in school textbooks actually stronger, now I think certainly stronger anti-Japanese messages than you find actually in state-approved, party-approved history textbooks in places like Shanghai, which I've looked at. I mean, there's another set of questions actually about the extent to which social media in China is or isn't state-controlled, because the party has tried to infiltrate it. But of course, it's not totally state-controlled. And this, well, brings us back to the reasons why anti-Japanese messages continue to have currency in societies, particularly in Northeast, more than perhaps in Southeast Asia, which are more complicated than simply, you know, decisions taken in the presidium of the Chinese Communist Party to brainwash their population. Well, we've run out of time, but I should also confess that we haven't been able to look at what, in some ways, would be more interesting, which is the way in which Japan is perceived at a popular level across East Asia. We are looking at attempts to project images of Japan through various media, but we're not looking at how those images are received. But of course, that would be an absolutely massive project, and if anyone would like to fund it.
Last comment, but not a question, a comment. Yeah.
Just a real quick binary question. I think everyone, in your various ways, you've detected a change from the 1980s to 1990s. And there's one school of thought in finance that actually America kind of dropped Japan after the Cold War. It was an unsinkable carrier. To what extent did America sort of keep the Chinese from looking to America dropped Japan, as it were, from 1948 to 1988, 1989, America was defending Japan as really important. And then when the Cold War stopped, Japan was less important. And perhaps it kind of, America was protecting Japan, and China and other places were able to invite more criticism, or detect more criticism. To what extent was America perhaps protecting Japan from itself? And then when the other Asian cultures decided that America was not protecting Japan, did people reevaluate Japan's role and potentially look at the war, look at things? You saw a lot of issues in the 90s come out that weren't explored when America and Japan were so important. And maybe that's just sort of a binary yes or no, whether that influenced, because in the textbooks and other things you notice that you've detected some change by the image of Japan.
I mean, I think a very quick response is it probably partially yes, but you've also got in parallel, of course, the rise of China as an economic power. One of the things that's very noticeable, for instance, in Hong Kong and China, there is absolutely no mention made of the economic aid that Japan gave China in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. You know, and I think China's economic rise is put it in a very different position than the 70s and 80s.
Very briefly, I think the end of the Cold War meant that the sort of weakening of America's alliances with authoritarian regimes around the region, which in turn lifted the lid on a lot of issues to do with the war.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel.